Shape dictates function. You have to keep this in mind. The shape of this atom we see here, the different orbitals. The orbitals give it a shape that is distinct for this atom and can only be found with this atom under this conditions. The shape will determine how it interacts with other shapes, other atoms. Now, in biology, we like to think of in terms of metabolism. You know, you've heard people, my metabolism's slow, things like that. What we're actually talking about when we talk metabolism is chemical reactions. The chemical reactions that occur within your cells that allow for the building or the breakdown of whatever. As you learned in chemistry, all chemical reactions, and in biology, hence all metabolic reactions, start off with reactants and end with products. You start with the reactants, 2 hydrogen peroxides. Enzymatic reactions will result in the products, 2 water and 1 molecule of oxygen. Just like in chemistry, we have irreversible and reversible reactions. The irreversible, as we just saw on the previous slide, the breakdown of hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide breaks down to water and oxygen. The oxygen is going to be released as a gas. Well, water is not going to automatically combine with oxygen to reform hydrogen peroxide. No, it's going to take some help. We'll see in later chapters that help comes in the form of enzymes. Reversible reactions, which you're used to seeing up in chemistry. The breakdown and the rebuilding, the back and forth, the back and forth. So things will be broken down, things will be built back up spontaneously. What you saw in those where there's a reversible or irreversible reactions is the making and breaking of what are known as chemical bonds. Chemical bonds are what link 2 atoms together. It's what allows 2 atoms of differing shape or same shape to come together to form something new. The reality of this is that the chemical bond for a lot of these molecules we'll be talking about through the semester are actually the sharing of electrons. As we see here, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. Hydrogen, remember it's going to be the left periodic table, it means it's highly reactive. Why is it highly reactive? Well, I'll tell you, it has to do with that 1 little electron right there. And if you count 2, 4, 5, 6, oxygen is short 2. So oxygen's going to be a greedy bugger. Hydrogens are going to give up because they're smaller, they're weaker. Quote unquote weaker. So what you see here in what is referred to as a covalent bond, it's actually the sharing of electrons. Hydrogen, in any given instant in this water molecule, how do I know it's water? 2 H's and an O, H2O. So any given instant, these 2 electrons we see right there can be in orbit around the hydrogen, making hydrogen very stable, very happy. Any other given instant, they're now in orbit, the valence orbit of oxygen, meaning it now has 8, meaning it is now happy, happy. This sharing of electrons we refer to as a covalent bond. So whenever you see covalent, think sharing. And as you've learned up in chemistry, More than one bond can be formed at any given time. Two oxygens come together, covalently bond, sharing 4 electrons. 2 bonds. How many how many bonds? Count the number of electrons, divide by 2. For every 2, there's 1 bond. So 4 electrons will be shared, hence 2 bonds. This is referred to as a double bond. You could have triple bonds, which are rare but still exist. Now, sometimes it's not an actual sharing of electrons. Sometimes it's the stripping away. If you remember in the last lecture, talked about Na plus Cl minus. What happens is sodium has this one little electron right there, whereas chloride, 2, 4, 6, 7. 7 electrons. Its valence shell is almost full. It is almost stable. Sodium and chloride come into close proximity. What's going to happen? Chloride, being much bigger, is going to strip away this 1 electron. This 1 electron that we see right here is going to get pulled over and is now going to be in orbit around chloride. What does this do? Well, sodium's outer shell is now empty. It's stable-ish. Chloride, somewhat full. It's full, so it is stable. The problem we see, and why we call this an ionic bond and not a covalent bond, the stripping away means that sodium now has 1 more proton in its nucleus than does electrons, thus Na+. Chloride has 8 electrons, but only 7 protons, meaning it is now heavy, has 1 more electron than protons, and it now has a negative charge. You've heard the old saying, opposites attract. Think of it like magnets. A positive and a negative attract towards each other. So, the sodium chloride that you eat, that table salt, it's not actually bonded together, the sodium and chloride. They are just drawn towards each other. Now, when you look back at the covalent bonds, the sharing of electrons, what we find is that sometimes it's not an equal sharing. Sometimes one of the atoms in a molecule is so much bigger and has a greater pull, so that you can actually have an unbalanced sharing, where one atom in the molecule has the electrons more often than not. We call this polar. It will set up quote-unquote poles, positive, negative, north-south pole. Water, great example of this. Because of the unequal sharing, you end up with this delta positive, this delta negative. What this means is the electron from this hydrogen is going to more often than not be over here orbiting around the oxygen. Every so often goes over and then it comes back. Goes over and then comes back. Since it's not an equal, it's not spending most of its time over here. More often than not, this oxygen has 1 or 2 electrons more than it does protons. Thus, it is semi or negative-ish. That's what this delta negative means. Whereas over here, this hydrogen, more often than not, is just a proton sitting out here. Every so often, that electron comes out and then spends more time over here at the oxygen. Back around, and then more time over here. That's why you see delta positive. Sometimes More often than not, it's just a proton out there. Proton being positive. So now you have a positive end and a negative end. Polar. Not all molecules do this. You look over here. Methane. Methane is a nonpolar. Why? Because there's an equal share between the carbon and the hydrogen. It doesn't set up this delta positive, this delta negative, which will come into play later in this chapter. We find that molecules that are mostly carbon, not oxygen, mostly carbon-based, are going to be what we refer to as nonpolar. The carbon equally shares the electrons. For every instant the electron's around the carbon, another given instant it's around the hydrogen, and back and forth equally. Thus it doesn't set up the positive-ish end or a negative-ish end. We're going to find that many of our molecules that make up our bodies are going to be this non-polar. When it comes to these covalent bonds, the sharing of electrons, we're going to find they're not easy to make. They don't just spontaneously occur. The ionic interactions, they just kind of happen because opposites attract. With these covalent bonds, since they're hard to make, it's going to take energy. More often than not in the biological systems, it means there's going to be an enzyme forcing two atoms to come together. If it takes energy to make, it means it's going to take energy to break. So you're going to have some sort of an enzyme and energy to break the bonds. Now, two types of bonds that don't require energy in any way and are considered to be very weak. First one being hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds, as we're going to see in the next lecture, is when two molecules that have a positive-ish due to hydrogen and a negative-ish end, generally due to some oxygen, are going to be attracted towards each other. Not as strong as the ionic, but there's going to be some sort of attraction. No energy to make this attraction, thus no energy to break the attraction. And lastly, we have what are referred to as van der Waals interactions. Van der Waals interactions are proximity. You force two molecules close enough together that you exclude the water between them, you exclude the gas from the atmosphere between them, they will interact.